The city breathed in two registers simultaneously. On the surface, red banners stretched across Gorky Street like wounds against a winter sky, loudspeakers pushing heroic marches into the frozen air, school children rehearsing songs about a father who watched over them from every wall. Beneath that surface, a different city entirely. A city where men learned to sleep lightly, where telephones were answered on the first ring and dreaded on the second, where a knock at 3 in the morning was not a neighbor borrowing salt. Moscow in the early 1950s was a theater in which every actor knew their lines and none of them believed a single word. This was the world that Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin had built. And in the winter of 1953, at the age of 73, he was slowly disappearing inside it. Those who saw him regularly in his final years spoke about it only decades later, when the fear had partially lifted and the words could finally come. The testimony is remarkably consistent. A man who had once filled every room he entered now sometimes seemed to fill nothing at all. Georgy Berezhkov, a former interpreter, recalled a Stalin who would sit for hours at the long table in his office without summoning anyone, without reading a document, simply staring. Guards at the Blizhnaya Dacha, the Near Dacha outside Moscow, his preferred residence, described a figure who moved through hallways at strange hours barefoot, apparently unaware of where he was going. The physical accounting was brutal. Decades of 18-hour workdays of cigarettes and Georgian wine, of a paranoid alertness that never fully released even in sleep. These had produced a body running on borrowed time. His blood pressure, according to documents declassified in the 1990s from the archives of the 4th Special Department of the Ministry of Health, had been dangerously elevated for years. Atherosclerosis had been progressing steadily. As early as the autumn of 1952, his personal physician, the very category of person who would soon become extremely dangerous in the Soviet Union, had recommended immediate and complete rest, total removal from all duties, a cessation of everything. The recommendation was, of course, ignored by the man himself and by everyone around him who would have needed to enforce it. You did not tell Stalin to rest. You did not tell Stalin anything he did not wish to hear. This was not a preference or a personality quirk. It was the central organizing principle of Soviet life. The truth in Stalin's presence was not suppressed. It was never born. Then came the doctor's plot, and the temperature of the entire country shifted. On the 13th of January, 1953, Soviet newspapers published the announcement that 9 prominent physicians, doctors who had treated the highest levels of Soviet leadership, had been arrested on charges of sabotage and terrorist medical murder. 6 of the 9 were Jewish. The accusations were almost cosmically disproportionate to any conceivable reality. These men, according to the official charges, had conspired with foreign intelligence services and Zionist organizations to murder Soviet leaders through deliberate medical negligence and malpractice. The country lurched into a state of organized hysteria. Letters poured into newspapers denouncing Jewish doctors. Medical institutions quietly began removing Jewish physicians from sensitive positions. Rumors spread, some of them clearly seeded by state media, that a massive action was being prepared. Historians who have spent careers studying this period are in broad agreement. The doctor's plot was not the conclusion of something, it was a prologue. The machinery of deportation, the cattle cars, the distant camps, all of it was being positioned for a scale of action that would have made the 1930s look like a rehearsal. The only question, the question that history would answer in the cruelest possible way, was whether the man who had designed the machine would live long enough to pull the lever. The 28th of February, 1953, a Saturday evening sliding into a Sunday morning, at the Near Dacha, in a private screening room Stalin had ordered, built when his eyesight made reading difficult, a small group gathered for what had become a ritual, watching films and eating dinner that stretched into the early hours. The guest list that evening reads like a roll call of the men who would divide the Soviet Empire among themselves within the week. Lavrenti Beria, head of the secret police and master of a surveillance apparatus so comprehensive that the word privacy had become essentially a foreign term. Georgy Malenkov, considered by many within the Kremlin to be the most likely heir, Nikita Khrushchev, the Ukrainian party boss whose peasant bluntness concealed a political intelligence of the first order, Nikolai Bulganin, the defense minister, quieter than the others and watching. By all accounts, Stalin was in good spirits. This detail appears in multiple testimonies and is important precisely because of what follows. He was not showing visible signs of acute distress. He drank light Georgian wine, the kind he favored, and he ate and he appeared to those men who had spent years learning to read him the way sailors read weather, to be relatively content. He even turned the wine glass toward his guest, which was understood as an invitation to drink. Coming from Stalin, this was practically an embrace. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, the guests departed. One by one, their cars rolled down the long driveway, headlights cutting through the late winter dark. Beria rode with Malenkov. Khrushchev left separately. Bulganin followed. Stalin walked inside his dacha. This was the last time anyone would see him standing. What followed is one of the most astonishing institutional failures in the history of modern statecraft. And whether it was a failure at all depends entirely on what questions you are willing to ask. The security apparatus at the Near Dacha operated under a principle that had evolved over years into something approaching religious doctrine. You did not enter without being summoned. You did not check without being called. The logic was impeccable in its own terms. Uninvited entry into Stalin's presence had historically produced consequences ranging from severe to fatal. The guards were not merely following orders when they maintained their posts on the 1st of March and watched the hours accumulate. They were following the deepest instinct of anyone who had survived in proximity to this man. The instinct not to be noticed. All day the curtains stayed drawn on his bedroom windows. No bell rang, no intercom crackled. The guards changed shifts and discussed nothing. The kitchen staff prepared meals that sat untouched. The afternoon light moved across the dacha grounds and then faded. And still no one moved toward that door. It was not until late in the evening, around 10 or 11 o'clock, more than 17 hours after the guests had departed, that a guard named Peter Lozgachev decided he had to do something. He chose the only justification that seemed safe. There was mail to be delivered, a pretext, a fiction that gave him permission to exist in a space he was otherwise forbidden to enter. He opened the door to the small dining room. Joseph Stalin, the general secretary, the vazd, the father of nations, the man whose image hung in every school and factory and government office, from Warsaw to Vladivostok, was lying on the floor in a pool of his own urine. He was alive. His eyes were open, but he could not speak, could not rise, could not make himself understood. One hand was raised slightly as though he had been trying to gesture toward something, and the capacity to finish the movement had simply stopped. Lozgachev was terrified. Not of Stalin, of what to do next, of who to call, of what it would mean to be the person who had made this call. He called the head of the household guard. The head of the household guard called the duty officer. The duty officer began the process of reaching the men who had left the dacha a few hours earlier. Beria reached at last, listened to the description of what had been found, and made his assessment. Stalin, Beria said, was probably just sleeping. Nothing to worry about. No need for panic. The phone went quiet. Outside the dacha, the machinery of the Soviet state continued its rotations. Night editors prepared morning editions that would carry nothing unusual. Telegraph operators transmitted the ordinary volume of overnight traffic. In cities across 11 time zones, people were sleeping, dreaming, waiting for morning in a world they assumed would look essentially like the one they had always known. The man who had built that world was on the floor of a room in the dark, and the people who knew it were deciding, each in their own way, what to do with what they knew. This is where the story of Stalin's death actually begins, not in the medical reports, not in the official announcements, not in the solemn state funeral that would follow. It begins in those first phone calls, in those first decisions about urgency and priority, in the gap between what was known and what was done about it. That gap would last 18 hours. And whether it was, as the official account insists, simply a product of the paralyzing fear that Stalin himself had cultivated, or whether it was something else entirely, is the question that has refused to close for more than 70 years. The evidence exists, the testimonies exist, the documents, those that have been released, exist. What remains is the willingness to follow them where they lead. There is a particular kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a decision. The Near Dacha on the night of the 1st of March, 1953, was full of this kind of silence. Guards stood at their posts and said nothing. Telephones were lifted and then replaced without being dialed. Men who had spent their entire careers learning to anticipate Stalin's wishes now applied that same expertise to the task of not anticipating anything at all. The machinery of protection that surrounded the most powerful man in the Soviet Empire ground quietly to a halt. And what is remarkable, what history has never fully resolved, is whether that halt was a mechanical failure or something closer to a unanimous, unspoken consensus. To understand what happened in those 18 hours, you have to first understand the world those men inhabited, not abstractly, specifically. Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria had survived in the proximity of Stalin longer than almost anyone. He had been head of the NKVD, then the MGB, then various recombinations of the same lethal apparatus under different acronyms since 1938. 15 years. In those 15 years, he had watched colleagues, friends, rivals, and subordinates disappear into the system he administered. He was not naive about what that system did or how it worked, because he was its architect and its engineer. He was also, by the winter of 1953, a man with reasons to be afraid. The doctor's plot had made this visible to anyone paying attention. The pattern of the accusations, the framing of loyal Soviet professionals as foreign agents, the ethnic dimension, the escalating rhetoric about hidden enemies within the highest echelons, this was a pattern Beria had seen before. He had helped design earlier versions of it, and unlike most Soviet citizens who could perhaps be forgiven for believing the official narrative, Beria understood with absolute clarity that the doctor's plot was not about doctors. Several historians working from documents that became available after the Soviet collapse have argued that Stalin was in the process of preparing a new major purge. The evidence is circumstantial but substantial. Personnel shifts in the secret police apparatus that would have undermined Beria's power base, the promotion of younger officials outside existing networks, the doctor's plot itself as a mechanism for generating public hysteria that could then be directed at designated targets. The list of potential targets, according to some sources, included Beria himself. This is not a fringe historical argument. It is taken seriously by serious scholars, and it means that when Lozgachev's phone call reached Beria in the early hours of the 2nd of March, Beria was not simply a loyal deputy receiving distressing news about his leader. He was a man who, if certain historical reconstructions are correct, had been living for months with the awareness that his own position was potentially terminal. What he did with that phone call is therefore not a minor administrative decision. It is the hinge of the entire story. Beria's response, as reconstructed from multiple testimonies, including those of the guards themselves, was to introduce delay through reassurance. Stalin was sleeping. There was no cause for alarm. The appropriate people would be notified in the morning. The framing was perfect in its simplicity. In a system built on the principle that no one acts without authorization, the statement that no action was required was functionally identical to an order to stand down. The guards, who had spent years being punished for excessive initiative, were not going to override this assessment. The household staff, who occupied an even more precarious position, were certainly not. The other members of the inner circle, Malenkov, Khrushchev, Bulganin, were not going to independently mobilize a medical response that Beria had implicitly vetoed. Khrushchev's own memoirs, written years later and treated by historians with appropriate caution given his obvious interests, contain an account that is nevertheless striking. He describes the moment when the calls began coming in, the confusion about whether to act, the collective paralysis. He describes Beria as the dominant voice arguing against immediate action. He also notably describes his own passivity, his own decision not to push back, not to insist, not to be the person who overruled Beria and summoned doctors in the night. Everyone, in other words, chose not to choose, and in a system like Stalin's, not choosing was itself a choice with consequences. The medical picture that the doctors found when they finally arrived on the morning of the 2nd of March has been analyzed extensively. The diagnosis was hemorrhagic stroke, a rupture of blood vessels in the brain causing bleeding that damages surrounding tissue. The medical consensus then and now is that this type of stroke is a genuine emergency in which time is the critical variable. The treatments available in 1953 were limited compared to what exists today, but they were not nothing. Early intervention, stabilization, management of blood pressure, basic supportive care could meaningfully affect outcomes. 18 hours lying on a cold floor untreated had not improved the situation. The physicians who entered that room faced something no medical training fully prepares a person for: a patient who was simultaneously the absolute ruler of their country and a helpless, incontinent figure on the floor who could not communicate. The terror they felt was not irrational. Several of Stalin's own doctors were at that precise moment sitting in prison under the doctor's plot accusations. The men summoned to treat him arrived knowing that the outcome of their treatment would be scrutinized by people who had already demonstrated a willingness to criminalize medical failure. If Stalin died under their care, the question of their culpability would be asked by the same apparatus that had already decided 9 of their colleagues were saboteurs. They performed their duties under conditions of almost unimaginable professional pressure. They documented everything. Their documentation, portions of which were declassified decades later, shows a meticulous and anxious record-keeping. Physicians writing not just for medicine, but for their own potential defense. While the medical team worked in Stalin's private quarters, something else was happening in other rooms of the Soviet government. The historical record here becomes more fragmentary, more contested, more dependent on sources with complicated motivations. But certain things are established. In the days between the 1st of March and the 5th, the days of Stalin's dying, meetings were held. Discussions took place. The question of succession of the structure of post-Stalin leadership was addressed in real time while the man himself lay in an oxygen tent. The speed with which the new governmental structure was announced after Stalin's death is, by any objective measure, extraordinary. On the 6th of March, 1953, the day after Stalin died at 9:50 in the evening, the official announcement of new leadership arrangements was made public. The portfolios were distributed. The titles were assigned. The hierarchy was established. Governmental transitions of this magnitude in any political system require negotiation, drafting, approval processes, the resolution of competing interests. They take time. The fact that this one appeared to take almost no time at all, that the machinery of succession was fully operational within hours of the announced death, tells you something. It tells you that the work had been done before the death, that the conversations had already happened, that the men standing at Stalin's bedside watching the medical bulletins being composed 3 times daily for public release had been simultaneously composing something else. This is not conspiracy theory. This is political science applied to a specific historical sequence. When a result appears instantaneously, it means the preparation was not instantaneous. The public, meanwhile, knew almost nothing real. 3 times a day, official medical bulletins were broadcast and printed. They were written in the careful technical language of Soviet officialdom, specific enough to sound authoritative, vague enough to obscure the actual prognosis. The Soviet people, who had grown up in a world where Stalin was not merely a leader, but something closer to a permanent atmospheric condition, received these bulletins with a kind of suspended dread. In Moscow, people gathered. This is documented in photographs, in memoirs, in the accounts of foreign correspondents who were present. Hundreds of thousands of people moved toward the center of the city, toward the places where they felt the weight of the moment most directly. The grief was real. This is important to say clearly because it can be lost in the analysis of what the inner circle was doing simultaneously. Ordinary Soviet people, many of them, felt genuine sorrow. Stalin was the only leader most of them had ever known. He had been present in their lives, on walls, in textbooks, in songs, in the ritual language of daily existence, since before they could form memories. The crowds became dangerous in their density. The specific number of people who died in the crush near Trebnaya Square and other areas of central Moscow remains disputed in the historical literature, but estimates range from several hundred to several thousand. The city had no infrastructure for grief at this scale. No one had planned for it because no one had been permitted to plan for the possibility that this moment would ever come. Somewhere in the distance between the private rooms where power was being redistributed and the streets where people were weeping, lies the essential nature of what Stalin had built. A system in which the leader was everywhere and the truth was nowhere, in which the public face and the private reality had been separated so completely that the two had ceased to have any organic relationship. On the 4th of March, one of the medical bulletins noted irregularities in breathing. On the 5th, the pattern became unmistakable to anyone reading carefully. That evening at 9:50, the medical team documented the cessation of vital signs. The accounts of those present in the room in those final minutes are among the most striking documents in 20th century political history. Not for what they describe happening to Stalin, but for what they describe happening in the people watching him. Khrushchev, in his memoirs, writes of weeping. Others describe a strange suspended silence. And then there is the account of Beria, described by multiple witnesses with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss, who left the room quickly after the death was confirmed and whose manner in those first moments did not resemble grief. By the following morning, the announcements were ready. Everything was in place. The 18 hours without a doctor can be explained. The explanation is even partially convincing. These were men trained by decades of Stalinist culture to be terrified of initiative, to wait for authorization, to understand that wrong action was more dangerous than no action. The fear was real. The paralysis was real. In a system built on punishment for mistakes, the safest move had always been to move slowly or not at all. But here's what the explanation does not fully account for. The same men who could not bring themselves to call a doctor in the night found within hours of the death the clarity and the confidence to restructure the government of the largest country on earth. The same paralysis that prevented urgent medical action apparently lifted completely when it came to the distribution of ministries and security portfolios. The men who had been frozen by fear were almost immediately decisive architects of a new order. You can explain the 18 hours as cowardice, or you can explain it as calculation. History has not yet closed the question. Perhaps it never fully will. The archives that might resolve it remain in significant portions inaccessible. The men who knew the most are long dead. What they said to each other in those rooms in those hours has not been found or has not been released. What remains is the sequence. What remains is the timing. What remains is the gap between a man on the floor and the call that was not made and the government announcement that was ready the morning after he stopped breathing. The gap is 18 hours wide. And in that gap, the entire question lives. History does not end when the powerful die. It accelerates. On the 6th of March, 1953, Soviet citizens woke to a world that was, on its surface, identical to the one they had fallen asleep in. The same streets, the same factories, the same queues outside bread shops, same portraits on the same walls, but something fundamental had shifted beneath all of it. The way geological pressure shifts beneath a landscape before the surface shows any sign of what's coming. The man who had been the organizing principle of Soviet existence for nearly 3 decades was gone, and the men who had watched him die were already, with remarkable efficiency, dividing the architecture of the world he had left behind. What happened next to those men, to that country, to the questions that the night of the 1st of March had generated, is a story that moves through decades and reaches, in ways that are not always obvious, all the way to the present. Lavrenti Beria lasted exactly 113 days. In the immediate aftermath of Stalin's death, he moved with a speed and confidence that surprised even those who knew him well. He reunified the security apparatus under his personal control. He made public statements, genuinely surprising ones by the standards of Soviet political speech, suggesting openness to reform, to a loosening of certain pressures, to a reconsideration of some of the system's more extreme features. He even, in what was either a sincere gesture or a calculated one, pushed for the rapid rehabilitation of the doctor's plot defendants. The 9 physicians who had been sitting in prison on charges of conspiring to murder Soviet leaders were released. The case against them was declared fabricated. This happened in late March 1953, less than 4 weeks after Stalin's death. The speed of the reversal was, if anything, more revealing than the reversal itself. Cases of this type in the Soviet legal system did not resolve quickly. They moved through layers of review, of documentation, of bureaucratic process. The fact that this one dissolved almost instantaneously suggested that the dissolution had been prepared, that someone or several someones had already done the work of unraveling it before it officially needed to be unraveled. Beria had the most obvious access, the most obvious motivation, and the most obvious means to have done that preparation. Whether he did it because he genuinely opposed the doctor's plot, or because it was useful to him politically to be seen opposing it, or because its rapid closure removed a piece of evidence that could become inconvenient. These are questions that his subsequent fate makes permanently unanswerable. On the 26th of June, 1953, Beria was arrested. The arrest itself was extraordinary, and a man of his position, controlling the instruments of state security, brought down from within by the very colleagues he had assumed were subordinate to or dependent on him. Khrushchev was the central architect of what happened. The charges eventually brought against Beria were extensive, covering decades of activity. His trial, conducted in secret, lasted less than a week. He was executed in December of 1953, 9 months after Stalin. The historical debate about Beria's fall is, in miniature, a version of the larger debate about Stalin's death. Was he removed because his former colleagues genuinely feared him? Because they had specific knowledge of things he had done that they could not permit to become public? Because the logic of post-Stalinist politics demanded a sacrificial figure on whom the crimes of the era could be concentrated? All 3 explanations have serious historical support, and they are not mutually exclusive. But there is a thread that several historians have pulled carefully without being able to follow it all the way to its end. Beria, of everyone in that inner circle, had been physically present in the most critical moments of the night of the 1st of March. He had received the initial calls. He had made the initial assessments. He had, by his own account and the accounts of others, been the primary voice counseling against urgent action. He knew, in other words, exactly what had and had not been done in those 18 hours. And why? Dead men do not give testimony. In a political culture built on the management of information, the elimination of the person who holds the most sensitive information is not an unfamiliar pattern. This does not constitute proof of anything. It is, however, a data point that serious historians note, and that the available evidence does not allow anyone to simply dismiss. Georgy Malenkov, who had stood at Beria's side through much of the transition and who had initially emerged as the most prominent figure in the new collective leadership, lasted somewhat longer. For approximately 2 years, he held the position of chairman of the Council of Ministers, nominally the most powerful governmental role in the post-Stalin structure. But the competition was fierce, and the political ground was unstable, and by early 1955 he had been maneuvered out of his central position. He was sent to manage a power plant in Kazakhstan. Later, a hydroelectric facility in Siberia. He lived ultimately until 1988, long enough to see from a considerable distance the beginning of the process that would eventually dismantle much of what he had helped build. He died at 86, having never said publicly what he knew about the night his era began. Nikolai Bulganin occupied prominent positions for several years and then receded, as figures of the second rank tend to do when the political weather changes. By 1958, he had been removed from the positions that gave him relevance, and he spent his remaining years in the kind of careful, managed obscurity that the Soviet system provided for men it had finished with but not destroyed. He died in 1975. Nikita Khrushchev is the most complex figure in the aftermath because he is the one who said the most. And even he did not say enough. In February of 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev delivered what became known as the secret speech. It was not, in the end, particularly secret. It was read aloud to party members across the country, and its contents circulated internationally within weeks. But its impact was seismic, precisely because it came from inside the system. Khrushchev stood before the party and named Stalin's crimes. He named the terror. He named the fabrications. He named the perversion of Soviet legality. He used the word cult of personality and gave it specific documented content. The world that heard this speech, Soviet citizens, Eastern European populations living under Soviet-aligned governments, Communist Party members in Western countries who had spent decades defending the system, experienced something genuinely unprecedented. The man who had been declared infallible had been declared by his own successor a criminal. The system that had claimed to be the most rational and scientific organization of human society had been running for decades on fear and lies. And yet, even in this speech, even in this remarkable act of partial rupture, Khrushchev did not address the night of the 1st of March. He did not discuss the 18 hours. He did not explore the specific decisions made at the specific moment when Stalin lay on the floor of his dacha. He spoke at length about what Stalin had done to others. He said almost nothing about what had or had not been done for Stalin at the end. This silence is not neutral. A man who was willing to denounce the crimes of a figure who had been, until 3 years earlier, essentially a deity. A man with that degree of political courage or political calculation or both chose not to open that particular door. The question of why is one that historians have returned to repeatedly. The most persuasive answer is also the simplest, because opening that door would have required him to stand inside it himself. He had been there. He had received the calls. He had made his own choices about what to do and what not to do on that night. Whatever Beria's role was, Khrushchev's passivity in those hours was a fact of record. The secret speech was, among other things, an act of survival. And some truths were incompatible with the speaker's survival. Khrushchev was removed from power in October of 1964 in a palace coup organized by colleagues who had concluded he was erratic, unpredictable, and increasingly dangerous to their interests. He spent his remaining years in a dacha outside Moscow under comfortable surveillance, occasionally tending a garden. He died in 1971. His memoirs, smuggled out and published in the West, are valuable and incomplete in roughly equal measure. None of these men, not one of the 4 who had dinner with Stalin on the night of the 28th of February, ever said, publicly and clearly, "We knew he was unwell. We chose not to act immediately. And here's why." The closest any of them came was Khrushchev's memoirs, which gesture toward the truth without fully committing to it, the way a man might gesture toward a door he's unwilling to open. The rehabilitation of the doctor's plot defendants did something that its architects may not have fully anticipated. It cracked something open in Soviet public consciousness that proved impossible to fully close again. For years, Soviet citizens had absorbed accusations of sabotage, wrecking, and foreign conspiracy without being given any mechanism for questioning them. The accusations arrived fully formed and officially certified. To doubt them was not merely socially dangerous. It was, within the logic of the system, a form of participation in the conspiracy being described. Doubt itself had been criminalized, not through explicit law, but through the consistent and predictable punishment of those who expressed it. When the doctor's plot was declared fabricated, when the state announced in effect that 9 men had been imprisoned on charges the state itself had invented, it introduced a logical problem into the system that no amount of subsequent management could fully resolve. If this accusation had been fabricated, What was the status of other accusations? If these 9 men had been innocent, what was the status of the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands who had passed through similar processes in the preceding decades? The question could not be answered within the framework the system provided, and a question that cannot be answered within a framework is eventually a question that destroys the framework. This is not metaphor. It is a description of a process that played out across decades in different forms through different political moments. The Khrushchev thaw, the dissident movement, the samizdat literature that circulated in handwritten and carbon-copied pages, the gradual expansion of what could be said and then thought and then demanded. The doctor's plot rehabilitation was not the cause of all of this, but it was among the first moments when the official narrative visibly contradicted itself in real time in front of living witnesses who had believed it. The generation that watched those 9 doctors walk out of prison in the spring of 1953 contained people who would spend the next 30 years asking, in various registers and at various levels of risk, the question that the rehabilitation had made unavoidable. If the system was wrong about this, where else was it wrong? That question passed from one generation to the next, refined and sharpened, and made more precise by each successive decade of experience, arrived in the 1980s with an accumulated force that the system could no longer absorb. What happened between 1985 and 1991 was not inevitable. History is never inevitable, but it was not accidental either. It was the delayed consequence of a series of cracks, and one of the earliest of those cracks ran through a courtroom in Moscow in the spring of 1953, when a state was forced to admit it had lied. So what do we actually know? We know that Stalin suffered a hemorrhagic stroke sometime in the early hours of the 1st of March, 1953. We know that he was found on the floor of his dining room, alive but incapacitated, by a guard who needed a pretext to enter the room. We know that the first call went to Beria. We know that Beria's response introduced delay into the process of summoning medical assistance. We know that 18 hours passed between the discovery and the arrival of doctors. We know that Beria had documented credible reasons to fear what a recovered Stalin might do. We know that the transition of power following Stalin's death was prepared with a speed that implies the preparation had preceded the death. We know that the doctor's plot, the machinery of a potential new purge, was dismantled within weeks. We know that Beria was arrested and removed 9 months later, and that the specific knowledge he held about those 18 hours died with him. What we do not know, what the available evidence does not allow us to know, is whether the delay was a decision in the sense of a deliberate, coordinated choice, or whether it was the product of a system so thoroughly poisoned by fear that it could not function even in an emergency. These are different things morally. They produce the same result practically, and here's what may be the most important thing of all. The distinction between them is, in a profound sense, exactly what Stalin had spent 3 decades making impossible to draw. He had built a system in which fear and calculation were indistinguishable from the outside, in which a man who was terrified and a man who was waiting produced identical behavior. He had made cowardice and conspiracy wear the same face. The architecture of that system was his greatest and most terrible achievement, and in the end it consumed him, not because anyone necessarily chose to let it happen, though someone may have, but because the system he had designed had eliminated the possibility of anyone choosing to prevent it. The guards would not enter without authorization. The deputies would not act without the guards' report. Beria would not be overruled by men trained never to overrule him. The doctors who might have saved him were sitting in prison on charges he had approved. Stalin died of a stroke. The medical fact is not in dispute. But the conditions that determined what happened in those 18 hours, the rules, the fears, the habits of mind, the institutional reflexes, the personal calculations, those were not natural phenomena. They were constructed. They were designed. They were the deliberate product of 30 years of systematic work by the man who was now lying on the floor, unable to speak, unable to summon help, unable to make the system move on his behalf. He had built a world in which silence was language, in which inaction was action, in which delay was a choice that left no fingerprints. He had built it so thoroughly that it functioned perfectly, even when, perhaps especially when, the only person it was failing to protect was him. The most powerful man in the world died alone on a cold floor because no one dared walk through a door. He had made sure of that himself.